Hi, David. It's great to be talking to you from across a very significant social distance.
It's true. It's great to see you as always, Jillian. I'm sorry we're not in the same town right now. We should be doing this together in one room.
I know. It'd be nice to actually be on a panel together, but alas, it's really great to be here chatting with you for Republica. So I'll kick off by asking you, and then I'll let you ask me some questions too. But what have you seen from companies during the pandemic when it comes to restrictions on free expression or the ways in which content moderation is being conducted?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a big question, in part because I think one thing that hasn't really changed all that much is the level of insight and transparency into what the companies are actually doing. I mean, I think there have been some good things that we've seen. It seems as if many of the companies have been highlighting the guidance of public health authorities, whether it's the WHO, which it should be for global platforms, or the CDC in the United States, or local public health authorities around the world. I mean, that part has been pretty good. But I think, there are many different ways we can go, and I'm sure we'll get into these over the next half hour or so. But the pandemic hits everybody. And that meant that the companies have sent a lot of their moderators home. I don't think they have figured out how to deal with what they perceive as privacy issues that their moderators in their moderating cocoons can deal with. And that means that they're, resorting quite a bit to automation. And I don't feel that I have great insight into how that's having an impact on their moderation, not just of pandemic issues, but of issues across the board. I don't know. Do you have a decent sense of what's happening?
I don't have a decent sense in terms of what's happening with the workers. I would, I think we would both probably point to Sarah Roberts' work on that. I know she's tracking it, but in terms of the actual content takedowns, I expect to see more things coming towards me. I think I agree with what you said, that the companies, these are people too, and they're all going through the same things that we're going through. And that I'm one of the loudest critics of some of these companies, but as I've talked to them on the phone, I've seen the strain that they're under, and I've had calls with people at Facebook sitting in their kitchens. So I think that one of the things that worries me the most right now really is the lack of capacity for follow-up, and really that comes in the form of appeals, right? Like, we have seen wrongful takedowns. We've seen questionable takedowns around misinformation, lots of stuff like that. We've also seen takedowns around misinformation that a lot of people are probably in favor of. But regardless of all of that, what worries me the most right now is that the companies are not putting their resources behind being able to fix these matters, customer service, as we would traditionally call it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And again, it's hard to know what's happening in terms of the number of takedowns, the kind of takedowns, the kinds of things that are being left up, the impact that has. I mean, there's a bit of a research-oriented question around these things, which is, if you take down content that shouldn't have been taken down, like if it's public health information, does that have an implication on how people perceive that information down the road? So it becomes less trustworthy. I mean, there's just all sorts of ways to game this out. I guess the one thing that struck me over the last couple of weeks as the most interesting issue was around the takedown of event pages related to these anti-lockdowns, because, they really highlighted the fact that the companies, in the absence of, and this was a particular US thing. I have no idea how this is playing out around the world. My guess is that this is not happening all over the place. But in the United States, at least, the takedown of event pages calling for anti-lockdown, anti-shelter-in-place protests struck me as really interesting, because on the one hand, it showed the companies, in this case, Facebook, as really stepping into the shoes of public authorities. And on the other hand, it was really unclear, and this was a communications screw up, I think, in a lot of ways too. Like, why were they doing it? Was it on the demand of a government? I mean, governors were saying, no, we didn't tell them to take this stuff down. So I just found the whole episode, and it was just like, I mean, in pandemic time, it seems like years ago, but I think it was just like a week ago. It seemed like an intense window into the power of the companies when it comes to public debate and discourse.
Yeah, no, and I think it really plays into something that we've been seeing for a long time, which is this kind of companies stepping in or being pushed to step in where the state can't get something done. So, one of the key examples of this that I've seen is with the UK online harms bill last year. Essentially, the government trying to push companies to regulate speech that they can't make illegal. So, it's a state going, oh, well, we can't ban this, so we're going to have you ban it for us. In that case, I see it as, purely a bad thing. In this case, it's tricky because what we're seeing is really companies kind of stepping in where states are failing. And I don't really know what to say about that. I mean, it's kind of, I've seen that with anti-vaccine speech before this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we've seen companies point to the CDC, correct misinformation or take down misinformation around vaccines. And that's something where, in the US, at least, there's not the will to put out an appropriate public health policy from my perspective.
That's totally right. I mean, we're in complete accord on that. I mean, and that, shocking. I mean, I think that that one of the things, so for me, that like this moment really does emphasize is, I mean, as I was saying before, and the point on the online harms bill, I think indicates also is, the companies have so much power. Governments aren't really quite sure, even after years of discussion around this, and you've been involved in this from the earliest days of these discussions, government still doesn't have a handle on how to regulate the companies in a way that takes into account their massive public impact. And it doesn't even require us to think about the companies as, the public square or something like that. It's about their impact. And the online harms bill is a really interesting case about on that question, because, maybe it has different set of rules that might be applied once it actually gets tabled as legislation and all that. But like the NetzDG in Germany, I think there's also a sense that it's creating incentives that the wealthiest, biggest companies can apply, and yet it's going to be harder for new entrants to participate, even if there would ever be new entrants. So it's like this push-pull, but it seems to be reaffirming, like everything seems to reaffirm the kind of overwhelming power of the companies.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that's one thing that it's not only reaffirming their power, but also existing social stratification, right? So we see it with the companies, but we also see it with like these laws in Europe, the NetzDG law, the terrorism regulation, and other things coming up around the DSA, Digital Services Act. Sorry. I think, some of the concern that I have there too is that it's what we've had historically is this very American-centric perspective from the companies, right? Like, they came up with their ideologies about what's acceptable. They banned nudity from the very beginning, which is something that we probably wouldn't have seen from a European company. But now you're getting this European regulation, and I understand where it's coming from, but a lot of it is still going to replicate existing inequalities for the rest of the world. Even if, and I'm not in favor of NetzDG, but even if one is in favor of the spirit of the law, the problem there is that it's only applied to protect people here, right? It doesn't affect anyone else anywhere. And I really worry that we have reached that point of this kind of, I hate the term balkanization, but this broken, bordered internet.
I think that's exactly right, and it's. I mean, I think the way you put it is really sharp, which is, and I hadn't really thought about it this way so much, but it's true that you see this increasing regulation, or at least the potential for regulation in Europe. Like, of course, there is NetCG, and there are other things, in France, possibly in the UK, that are coming down, and I agree that they're sort of, well, on the one hand, the companies, it's not just Facebook, but it's also YouTube, Twitter, Google, others, who are responsive to those pieces of legislation, or even the potential for legislation, because of the markets where they're involved. And so you might end up seeing this kind of rich set of regulation in Europe, maybe in the United States after this year, who knows? I mean, the U.S. is dysfunctional on all these things, but then these are global platforms, and around the world, they just don't have. I mean, I'm sure you've had these same conversations with either government officials or civil society. It is really hard to get the attention of the companies, and yet they still have massive impact on public space there. So I agree with you. I mean, I think there's this potential for the next several years to involve. I mean, balkanization is not a bad word for it. Kind of a splintering. It's not the old sort of splintering of the internet that we've always talked about. It's the splintering of rules that the platforms are applying in different places, and it completely undermines the idea of them being global and having like one community, which maybe they put behind anyway. But it also, I agree, it really reinforces the power of some communities over others.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, a lot of times this does feel like a really impossible problem because, on the one hand, like when we talk with people in our networks, from the global south, from countries, particularly countries where they're underrepresented languages, a lot of what I hear is, we want to have local expertise. We want to have people who, understand the culture, understand the context, who are making the rules and doing the moderation. And I think that that's a very reasonable request. But then you've got incidents like what happened last fall, where I think 60 some odd individuals were mass suspended from Twitter for using this. I'm not going to use the word because I don't know what our audience is like, but for using a word in Arabic that essentially kind of means like bootlicker, let's say.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
that's like a polite version of it. And those folks got booted off the platform. And, I've talked to somebody about it who speculated that the reason this happened was because they were relying on local expertise. And the person who made that call was more conservative, But I think it's really wrong that Egyptians can't speak truth to power to their politicians in the same way that, people do every day on Twitter to Trump. And Twitter ended up fixing this situation in the end. But it's a real catch-22 with those kinds of calls.
Yeah, I completely agree. And the other part of this that highlights is, I mean, I think you and I talk a lot about how the companies have real power, they have authority to, and immunity when it comes to moderating speech, regulating speech on the platforms. But I think one of the things that we're also seeing, and again, I think it's still early in the pandemic to draw some real strong conclusions about this, but it seems like there's also an increased amount of pressure from governments on speech on platforms. So it's pressure on the companies, but also pressure on on users themselves, and part of this has been kind of the groundwork had been laid by laws like in Singapore around deliberate online falsehoods, but also just false information laws in places like Egypt and other pretty like seriously speech repressive places, and I think I struggle with this quite often in the sense of we want to put attention on what the platforms are doing to regulate their own space. And there's just not a lot of transparency around what governments are doing to make demands of the companies as well. I mean, your Egypt example is a good one. It's hard to know where that actually comes from.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other example from, and I hate to drag Twitter because I feel like they're actually, at least in this current moment, I think that they're really taking some incredible measures to do a good job here. But looking to the past a little bit, Twitter, as we know, was famously infiltrated by the Saudi government. And one of the things that was really interesting about that to me is that we've almost reached this, like, I don't know, was it 3.0, 4.0, in the way that states are engaging with the internet, right? So like, and I use the number system kind of looking back at Ron Diebert's early work, where, 2.0 was, I think, surveillance, and then you've had these other measures, and now what we're seeing is actually governments infiltrating companies. We're seeing them paying people to comment. We're seeing botnets, all of that, and it's really difficult. I get a lot of questions from people going, okay, well, why can't companies just easily take out all the inauthentic actors, or why can't we have real names so that this isn't a problem? And it's like, well, that's just not how the world works. So I think that we're going to see a lot of these challenges moving forward.
Yeah, I'm curious what you make of Twitter's takedown of Bolsonaro's tweets, and sort of he had some tweets that were clearly disinforming around coronavirus, and he's been one of the lead COVID denialists out there. But Trump has also been promoting some disinformation on the platform. I mean, what do you make of, like, where the rules should be, like where the enforcement of the rules should be drawn on a case like that?
Yeah, I think it's really tricky. I mean, I think, on the one hand, I can say that I do feel like these companies are giving Trump a bigger pass than they are to foreign leaders. And they have been for a long time. I mean, everyone goes, oh, this is the first instance of this happening. It's like, no, it's not. Have you looked at what they've done to Iranians? No, like they've gone after Iranian officials on a number of occasions. So that's one thing. But I think, what should they be doing? I would like to see a lot more research on cause and effect when it comes to misinformation. I think that we're often going at this blind. The perspective is generally that censorship alone is never the answer. But I do think in these cases that they should be putting a lot more power and resources into finding ways to creatively correct misinformation and boost correct information. And that's why it worries me when they take the lazy way out and just go, oh, look at the CDC. Yeah, well, a month ago, the CDC was telling me not to wear a mask. So I'm not really sure that they're the best experts on this subject.
Yeah, I think that's right. I released a report last Friday, or at least it was posted, for the Human Rights Council on sort of pandemics. Yeah, I'll send you the link. No, it's just hot off the press, if we can say that in digital space. But one of the things, like, as I was, it was a more quickly done, report than usual because of the crisis. And one of the things I found was that it was like a year and a half, 2 years ago, the WHO had released a report, it's like a guide called Managing Epidemics. And it's really interesting because, and maybe you ghost wrote the report, Jillian, because one of the things they really highlight is the importance of correcting misinformation. And I think there's a risk of, we're stuck in this binary, right? It's like you either take it down or you leave it up. And I think, like, one of the things that I was getting, and the WHO wasn't talking about online space in particular, but the idea that, governments should treat individuals, citizens, the public as adults, and say, and actually, companies can do the same thing, and the takedown might not actually have the impact. I think you're right. We need to know more about the impact of a takedown on sort of on public attitudes. But if there's another approach where they can, look at the material and say, Bolsonaro's saying this, but you should be aware that, public health authorities actually say this. Like that, that might be stronger, approach, certainly to treating individuals like, humans who have critical thinking capacity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think that there's a real risk with, especially when it comes to medical misinformation. I did an interview with Biela Coleman recently for EFF where we talked about the historical issues around medical misinformation, right? So it wasn't that long ago that LGBT people were considered mentally ill. It wasn't that long ago that transgender people were considered mentally ill, and if those communities had freedom to push back against the medical professions, we might not be where we are today. And I think we're seeing the same things now when it comes to certain like autoimmune diseases and things like that, where some communities are not accepting the medical line because the medical line seems geared toward profit. And I know, that sounds like conspiracy thinking, and I don't see this broadly, right? I'm very much pro-vaccine. I'm very much pro-medicine. But I do think that there are edge cases, and we do need to consider those when we're talking about these kinds of regulations. And I've seen some really ridiculous takedowns recently, by the way, around misinformation. Yeah.
Really? Like what?
I saw one the other day that was, oh yeah, I saw one the other day that was a meme. It was definitely a joke. I think it said, the little, I don't know what it's called, the little thing that comes out of a car tire where you pump the air into it. It said, clip this to remove your car's RFID chip. And Instagram slapped a like, this is misinformation on it.
Right.
I was like, great, now we're adjudicating memes, but we're not going after Trump.
Right, exactly. But that's a really good example of, sort of the inadequacy of all of these approaches that sort of treat things as a kind of binary. And we know, and you've been saying this for a long time too, the capacity of companies or governments to distinguish between humor, satire, parody, and, actual disinformation that, really intentionally seeks to cause harm. That's really hard for anybody to address in a coherent way.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think weighing real harm is always going to be a challenge, right? The fire in an empty theater, although funny enough, now, probably illegal to shout that since crowds are illegal. But, these being great examples, right? Where weighing real harm is a complicated matter. And of course we can say, oh yes, incitement, but what really is incitement? And maybe some things that, that Americans are reluctant to call incitement might have a real impact. So, I want to see more research. I want to see more academic work coming out on all of this.
Yeah, I think that part is, to me, really important on, like, in the sense that, there is something different about online space when it comes to issues like incitement, at least in terms of how we understand the not just the effect, but the intention of harassment, of disinformation, which often is a mechanism of silencing individuals and silencing communities. And I think that, part of this goes back to the long-term marination of the companies in American attitudes toward free speech, right? Like, more speech is always good. But that doesn't really work on the platforms when, the speech is designed to silence others. And I think that fundamental kind of perception has been a real barrier for smart moderation on the platforms and smart regulation. And I would say, I can't take myself out of that, of the blame there. I think that my own attitude towards speech that, in a non-digital space, you would allow, but in a digital space might have a different impact. Like, I'm not sure I saw that as clearly as people like you did early on.
I'm not quite sure why I saw it. I think it has a lot to do with just moving out of the US at a very young age. But
Mhm.
I think that ultimately, this is a really, I'm noticing that we're running out of time. I think that this is a great
Mm.
time for companies to do a full audit of their policies, to look back and say, okay, like, is the world that we live in now the same as the one where we started these policies? And is this a real, maybe this is a good time to do a full scale consultation, the way that like Facebook did when creating its oversight board, and figure out what really works for the whole world.
I think that's right, and I think that, I mean, for me, that's a great segue as we start to wrap up. I do think that this is a time when the companies, even though, as we started off with, I mean, they're dispersed, they're not in the same place, they're all on place at the moment. But I think it's really essential for them to do this kind of ongoing assessment. I mean, I think of it as a human rights impact assessment, but an ongoing assessment of whether their rules are actually achieving, human rights compliant objectives. And, it's interesting. This will be posted right around the time that Facebook announces the composition of its oversight board and really launches it. And it'll be interesting to see, although that's more of a general approach to content moderation, it'll be interesting to see if that helps trigger more of this kind of ongoing reflection around the impact of the rules on the public, and also maybe triggers for governments and for the public the idea that the companies are taking these steps without the same kind of democratic accountability that we expect of governments. And I think we need to find a way to marry those things together, both the company's responsibilities and the importance of democratic oversight, which we just don't have right now in most places.
Yep, absolutely agree. Well, I think
Jillian, we
that we're
agree
meant to
on too
wrap
many
up.
things here.
I know we
Yeah.
do. Glad that they didn't tell us this was a debate.
Yeah, exactly. It was more like a agreement fest, a love fest. I'm excited
Indeed.
to
Well, it's
read
been
whatever you're working on now. I know you're working on a manuscript. I'm excited to see that
got a book coming out
as soon
next
as it's
year. Yep. I'm excited to
very
share it.
exciting. Very exciting. Great. Well, I hope I see
Great.
you in
Well, thank
person
you
soon.
so much. Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Take care, Jillian. Thanks.
Take care.